Hitler turns up early in the morning. The meeting was supposed to be later in the morning. He turns up really early, 6:30. Basically goes down or the corridor of the hotel, banging on all the doors, saying, "Right, all of you out, you filthy lot." So he sort of rounds up the leadership in one fell swoop.
It's the 2nd of July, 1934, and we are in Germany. And what event are we talking about today, Roger Moorhouse?
Well, 2nd of July, 1934 is the end of the Night of the Long Knives, which is actually, it's slightly longer than a night. It's the Röhm purge. Used to be known actually in the Nazi propaganda narrative as the Röhm putsch. They tried to claim that Röhm had tried to take power, which actually he hadn't. Röhm was the head of the SA, the brown shirts.
But hang on. So what you're telling me is it's actually a weekend of the Long Knives.
Yes, it is. Yeah. Well, it's a long weekend.
A long weekend.
Because it's the long weekend of the Long Knives. Yes. I mean,
it's
it makes
the bank
it sound
holiday weekend of the Long Knives.
Yeah. I mean, it makes it sound a little bit more pleasant, I suppose, a little bit more sort of bucolic and like a bank holiday.
Exactly.
A bank holiday of murder.
Yeah, there's strawberries and beer as well as, knives and Nazis.
Yes. So, yes, the long weekend of the Long Knives culminates on the 2nd of July, 1934.
Talk us through the background. Everybody, I think, listening to this will know bits and pieces about the long weekend of the Long Knives. But talk us through briefly where we're at and why Hitler comes to the monumental decision that he's going to turn on his own people.
Yeah, his own side. So Hitler, of course, comes to power 18 months before. He's sort of levered into power at the end of January 1933. And has been busy in the meantime, basically sort of creating his dictatorship. And this is sort of the very tail end of that process. So he very quickly dispensed with, democratic process, the Reichstag fire, the Reichstag fire decree, and then the Enabling Act. All of that sort of gets rid of the cumbersome nonsense of democracy as far as Hitler's concerned. And, the whole coordination of German society, all of the other political parties are banned and all of this sort of thing. So all of that's happened up to this point. And you still have this slightly uneasy, almost three-cornered relationship between the Nazi Party themselves, Hitler and his closest acolytes and cronies, and the SA is within that umbrella, underneath that umbrella, but it's kind of slightly separate under Ernst Röhm. It has a slightly different kind of social makeup. It's slightly different politically. It's a bit more kind of socialist in its outlooks, in a sense that it takes the socialism of National Socialism a bit more seriously. So it kind of grew. I mean, it grew massively during the Depressions. It benefited in a sense from, providing gainful, not employment, but gainful activity for unemployed Germans. So, has that sort of socialist element that a lot of others don't. And the third party being the army. The army is, still not entirely sure. It's thrown its lot in with Hitler. It doesn't entirely trust Hitler. It doesn't trust Röhm at all, because it's worried that the SA is huge. So it worries that they will be bigger than the army and then a threat to them.
Sorry, I'm just gonna interrupt you there, Roger Moorhouse, and just for people who are less steeped in Nazi biographies than you, Röhm, can you just tell us a little bit about Röhm himself?
Yeah, he's quite an interesting character. Ernst Röhm, he'd fought in the First World War, very sort of rotund, red-faced character. He looks like a Colonel Blimp, actually. This is provoking mirth, I see. No, he looks a bit sort of Colonel Blimpish. If you imagine Colonel Blimp with a big scar across his cheek and half of his nose blown away by French shrapnel, but then you're close to what Ernst Röhm looked like. So he's very sort of Blimpish. I mean, we'd probably call him Gammony today. He was so it rose to the prominence, led the SA, which was like Hitler's boot boys. So the SA were the ones that would go and, beat up their opponents. It started out as hall security, sort of event security. And they used to beat up the socialists and prevent the socialists from breaking into Nazi meetings and stuff like that. So the battle for the streets in the late 20s and early 30s It was the SA doing all the fighting, cracking skulls in the name of the Nazi revolution. What's interesting about Röhm, most interesting, I suppose, is that he was openly homosexual, which at that time was illegal in Germany and was very much socially frowned upon. It really wasn't the done thing. I mean, we have this image, I suppose, of Cabaret and Christopher Isherwood and all of that, and certainly Berlin being a sort of rather libidinous and libertine city, which to some extent it was. But still, homosexuality in vast swathes of German society was completely frowned upon and was unacceptable and all the rest of it. He was openly gay, which is pretty unusual. And this is one of those aspects of the story that, in a sense, comes back to bite him. Hitler wasn't that bothered about his gayness until some of those people around him made him bothered about it. People like Himmler, who got in his ear and said, "This chap's unacceptable. You have to get rid of him." So his homosexuality then became a problem in 1934.
Okay, but Röhm and Hitler were, before 1934, pretty close. They were allies.
Yeah.
But Hitler turning on Röhm was not just a question of a sudden realization of morality, was it? There were political reasons for it too.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and they were very close friends. I mean, he's one of the few people that Hitler used to address in the familiar, in the du form. There weren't many people were on that list, and Ernst Röhm was one of them. And the sort of the turning on Röhm. So there is this three-cornered, wrestle going on that I mentioned, broadly the Nazi clique and Hitler, the SA and the army. They're sort of circling each other a little bit at this point. And the conservative elites as well, as a sort of a fourth element. They had been exercising themselves in the run-up to the Night of the Long Knives. So there's a famous event called the Marburg Speech by a chap called Franz von Papen, who's a former chancellor, where he basically tried to sort of rally the old conservative right and say, look, the Nazis are doing what... He was vice-chancellor to Hitler, but he's basically trying to rally the conservative right to say, these guys are, they're pretty violent, they're pretty criminal, we do need to sort of stand up and try and hem them in a bit. So that's the immediate background. So Hitler's feeling quite threatened by the SA and by the old conservative right. So he decides basically to do a sort of a clean sweep of everyone that he sees as a potential threat, everyone that has ever looked at him askance, anyone that's ever crossed him. And they basically, have set, with the SS, they draw up lists of various people. So the leadership of the SA is basically eliminated. A good proportion of whom are, like Röhm, are homosexual. So there's that strand to it is undeniable.
Sorry, that's really interesting. Did Röhm's like the animating spirit of the SA? Did he recruit other homosexuals to be part of the organization? Was that a deliberate thing?
Yes, he did. Yeah, well, partly because it was his, that was his world. That was his little clique of people that he knew and that he trusted and all the rest of it. And some of whom he'd had relationships with. He was fairly promiscuous. So some of them he'd had relationships, others not. And it's not really... I suppose it's easy to portray that in some way as a conspiracy. It kind of wasn't. That was just his world. That was his milieu. And those were people that he trusted, and they came from the same world, So he tended to promote those people to be his senior lieutenant. So there's one chap called Edmund Heines, who is his deputy, effectively, who was in charge of the SA in Silesia. Very young. I mean, he was compared to Röhm, he was very young. Hadn't fought in the first. I had fought in the First World War, but he was, in his 30s then. Again, homosexual. So they're numerous amongst the sort of upper echelons of the SA were actually homosexuals. As I said, this became a problem. It hadn't been a problem. Hitler didn't seem to be that bothered. All the way through the 90s and early 30s, there'd been various people, not least the left-wing press in Germany, before Hitler came to power and banned them all. They'd had a field day trying to expose Röhm's homosexuality, right? So they weren't tolerant of it at all, but they're playing politics with it. So they wanted to expose it and say, how can you have this man who openly does what he does? And Hitler always just said, well, I don't care. He does the job for me. He does it very well. The SA is not, it's not a sort of a girls' school for moral upstanding. It's a fighting organization. And as long as it fights, it's fine. So that was his attitude for a long time. And then you get people like particularly Himmler and Goebbels in his ear basically saying, this is unacceptable. Because there's that sort of strand of, there's a strand within Nazism which is very, culturally and morally conservative, uber conservative. And homosexuality was not acceptable behavior. So they're in his ear. So that, combined with the sort of the political ferment, the political problems that are mounting for Hitler in June 1934, basically leads him to say, okay, clean sweep, we'll get rid of the lot of them.
Okay, so that's the background. The long weekend starts on the 30th of June.
Yeah.
Just take us through some of the key murders.
Yeah. Well, most of the SA are rounded up in a place called Bad Wiessee, which is down in the south in Bavaria. It's a resort town on a lake. And quite cleverly, Hitler had, foreseen this problem arising, and he basically called the SA leadership to a meeting at Bad Wiessee. They had Röhm and a couple of his acolytes had been there for a spa weekend. It's lovely place, a nice sort of hotel there, the Pension Hanselbauer. So all of the SA leadership were called down to Bad Wiessee for this meeting with Hitler, and then Hitler turns up early in the morning. The meeting was supposed to be later in the morning. He turns up really early, 6:30, basically goes down the corridor of the hotel, banging on all the doors, saying, right, all of you out, you filthy lot, and all this sort of thing. And basically sends them all, first of all, to the cellar of the hotel, and then later to Stadelheim prison in Munich. So he sort of rounds up the leadership in one fell swoop. So that's quite a clever move, including Röhm. And then the same day, so while they're being moved from Bad Wiessee to Munich, and they're sort of languishing in the prison in Munich, most of those guys are killed the same evening. They're taken out one by one and shot by firing squad. Röhm Hitler was in doubt about Röhm. He wasn't sure whether he should allow, because they were friends and all of that. They had history. He was in two minds as to whether he would let Röhm live. So initially, the decision was made that they would leave him in his cell with a pistol, in the hope that he would do the honourable thing and kill himself. But Röhm, being stubborn, decided not to do that. So when he spectacularly failed to kill himself, they went in the following day on the 1st of July, and he was shot as well. So Röhm was killed on the 1st of July. On the same day, 30th of June, at the same time, the afternoon of that day, the hit squads of the SS are already going out around in Berlin, tracking down senior conservative politicians. So Kurt von Schleicher, who is the previous chancellor to Hitler. So this is a bit like Keir Starmer ordering the assassination of Rishi Sunak. Or even Andy Burnham ordering the assassination of Keir Starmer, you could say. But that's the sort of scenario. So they send a hit squad to Kurt Schleicher's house, Kurt von Schleicher. He's basically, gunned down in his office, along with his wife, incidentally. They basically say, are you Kurt Schleicher? And he says, yes. And there's like, bang, 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 bang. He's shot, I think, 5 times. Utterly brutal. And various other sort of senior politicians. So the guy that had written the Marburg speech for Franz von Papen that had been given 10 days before, Edgar Jung, his name was, he was shot. In total, there's every sort of category of individuals. The old elites, even sort of quite new elites, but who are non-Nazis, new conservatives, like Jung, who was actually, not really an old conservative. He was more of a revolutionary, but a non-Nazi. And then even the guy that had edited Mein Kampf, whose name was Father Bernhard Stempfler, was rounded up by the SS and beaten to death. The reason being, you'd think he was on side, right? But the reason being was that he'd had a sort of exchange of rude letters through the newspapers, where one of the Nazi newspapers had basically said this was a man who had no original ideas in his head. And he wrote back basically saying, well, I was the one that hammered Mein Kampf into shape. Thank you very much. So, and this carried on over a number of months, but it was enough to put him on the list. So he considered himself a loyal Nazi, but because he'd crossed Hitler and made Hitler look bad, that was it. He was on the list. So the total number of people killed over this 3 days, this long weekend, the official figure is about 87, but unofficially, it could be up to, 300 plus, it's because a lot of the a lot of the hit squads actually had their own lists as well. So they had their own lists of people who had sort of pissed them off. So they would go and find those people and kill them as well. So this is why we don't know precisely how many people were killed. So it's anywhere between about 100 and maybe 300.
We'll talk a minute about, the reception and the legacy, but do we have any indication of how Hitler felt about killing his mate? He was friends with Röhm. Normally, obviously Hitler is a terrible, terrible human, but normally the deaths are at one remove from him, right? It's not, he's normally not up close and personal to the terror that he causes. But Röhm is close to him. He's an ally. He's a friend. Any reaction?
Yeah, and I think he did. Like I said, he did agonize a bit about whether Röhm should be murdered or not. And as I said, they were friends. They were on familiar terms, and they had been fighting the same cause for many, many years. So Hitler did agonize over that. I mean, you're right when you say the deaths that Hitler causes are at one remove. I mean, he's not the one that's going out there and doing it. And actually, there's sort of evidence really that actually Hitler's quite sort of squeamish in a way. He doesn't tour the bomb sites, for example. That's always Goebbels that does that. Hitler doesn't like to go and see the results of the war, for example. I mean, he has this sort of fetishization of war early on, particularly the Polish campaign, a bit in the French campaign. But then he just kind of shuts himself away and becomes a sort of a hermit warlord. So he's quite sort of squeamish in that respect. So it's an interesting one. I think the key thing here was that this is why you have those two narratives. The one of Röhm being a degenerate homosexual, that was the line that they would have used, right? So that he was not, that his homosexuality was not something that for Hitler to tolerate, as he had done. It was evidence of a wider degeneracy. That was the argument that someone like Himmler would have made, okay? So he was not only sexually degenerate, he was also politically degenerate, right? And that chimed with Hitler. So then, Hitler goes, okay, I get it. I get the problem. And then at the same time, the narrative that was given was that Röhm was actually planning to overthrow Hitler. Well, this is not true. There's no evidence for that. But that became the propaganda narrative. And that was also part of the sell from people like Himmler and Goebbels to Hitler to say, look, these guys absolutely have to be murdered and got rid of because they're trying to unseat you. So they made it personal. So they created the narrative whereby Hitler would say, okay, he's got to go. He's got to be killed.
So in terms of the reaction to it, so as you said at the top, Hitler comes to power really with the collaboration or cooperation of Germany's more traditional right-wing elites who didn't necessarily understand what it was that they were facilitating, or they thought they could use Hitler and then discard him. How seismic is this moment within Germany in making people understand exactly what their new regime really was?
Yeah. I think it is. It is 18 months in, but I think a lot of Germans are still, in a sense, in a sort of a honeymoon period with Hitler and the Nazis. So they're still a little bit kidding themselves. I mean, nothing happens overnight, effectively, right? This is a gradual process of the dismantling of democracy. I mean, the democracy had been ailing before Hitler came to power. That's part of the reason why he came to power. So it's not like, from black to white or the other way around. It doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual process. So the dismantling is ongoing and the creation of the Hitler dictatorship is ongoing, but it's not yet complete. It will be complete by the end of the summer of 1934. So this moment where they basically clear the decks of anyone that could possibly raise a hand and go, hang on, these guys are not okay. Whether it was from effectively the left, which was the SA, or from the right, which might be the conservative elites, anyone that could possibly stand in the way of the final stages of that creation of the dictatorship was being got out of the way, right? That's essentially what the Night of the Long Knives is. So for a lot of Germans, many of whom, I mean, of course, huge millions of Germans had voted for Hitler in the last free elections, which were in November of 32, okay? and would have voted for Hitler in good faith. I mean, they would have voted for Hitler because they thought, all of the other politicians had failed. Everyone had, sold us down the river. The economy was in tatters, huge unemployment. Germany's humiliated, all of this stuff. So let's give old Mr. Hitler a go. I mean, what could go wrong, right? So they're still living, huge numbers of them anyway, still living in that kind of slightly utopian view of what's going on.
How bad can it be?
Yeah. And this is a shot. This is when they go, my God, like, who are these people? They're out there murdering people. Right. And you've got hit squads running around. And like the previous chancellor, gets gunned down in his office. Proportion of the population that just go, oh my God, what have we done?
So, so we've talked before, and you made this clear in your brilliant book, The Forgers, that the Nazis were quite preoccupied with having legal buttressing of their horrible acts.
Mm.
What was the kind of legal position of what happens over the long weekend of the long knives?
That's a good question.
Are there lawyers? Like, have they brought in emergency laws? Like, is there a kind of, get out of jail free card if your victim of judicial murder is another Nazi? Like, how does it work?
It's a very good question. If you look at the very good example of Kurt von Schleicher, who was the previous chancellor to Hitler, right? Who was right-wing politician. I mean, not a good guy, but he was ordinary right-wing politician. Actually, after he'd been removed, so he was the guy that was removed in January 1934 when Hitler came to power. So Hitler basically replaced him the end of January, 1933 rather. So he basically retired, right? He basically, he read history books. He still had his circle of friends. He lived down in southwest of Berlin, nice villa, all of that. He'd spent a lifetime either in the military or in politics. And he basically said it was nice to retire and do nothing, right? Read history books, which is what he did. So it's not like he was meddling in plotting against Hitler, but because he basically pissed Hitler off in 1932 and before, he was on the list, and that was it. But his murder, he's murdered with his wife in his office in front of his housekeeper. So she sees the hit squad that come in, bang on the door. We must see General Schleicher. They're shown into his office, and they basically gun him down, and then they file out again. And the housekeeper sees everything, and she calls the police. Of course she does. And the police come, and they start, treat it as a crime scene and all of this, and take witness statements. And then halfway through the afternoon, the Gestapo turn up and say, "Okay, don't worry about all of this. We're closing this investigation." And in microcosm is what they do. So they basically close down the usual normal process of, a murder inquiry, which all of these murders would have generated. The Gestapo comes in and just says, "Okay, give us all the files, give us all of the stuff that you've already got, and we're closing down this investigation." So they literally went through and stopped every sort of normal legal process that was going on, and stopped the whole thing. And also whitewashed all of those records. So it's, they did a brilliant job, really, of sort of covering up a lot of that stuff. So there were no prosecutions until much later, the 1950s. If you were one of those, identified as a member of one of those hit squads and you survived the war, and they could track you down in the 90s, there was a chance that you would be prosecuted then. And there were a few examples of people who were, and given fairly derisory for murder. Yeah.
Interesting. So so technically these were murders. Yeah. They weren't, there was no kind of emergency legislation or anything like that. They were technically within the rule of the law murders, but the state just covered them up. I mean,
the state covers them up. And then Hitler gives this speech, I think it's about the 14th of July, so a couple of weeks after, where he basically says, he stands up and he says, "This is on me, right? It was my responsibility. I was protecting, the state. I am the chancellor. I am in charge, and I was facing a revolt against my authority." That's how he portrayed it. And he said, so, retrospectively, he gave a retrospective pardon to the killers at that point. So not only, it's belt and braces. They'd already shut down any sort of resulting investigations, but that was the moment where he said, all of that was okay because these guys were all traitors. right? So they were traitors against the German state, and I dealt with the problem. So that was the belt and braces. That was the retrospective pardoning as well.
Okay. And did it do what Hitler wanted it to do? Did it consolidate his power? It makes him stronger? Or does it, surely those forces that I sound like a conspiratorial person who's going to start talking about the World Economic Forum, but the forces that allowed Hitler to come to power, was there no mechanism by which, following the Night of the Long Knives, they could say, oh my God, we've made a terrible mistake, let's get him out? Or was he, how does Hitler manage the aftermath?
Yeah, that's a good question. So those forces, as you say, that had brought him to power, people like Schleicher and the clique around the President Hindenburg. So Hindenburg is still alive then. He died in August, so only a month later he dies. He's like 86, he's senile. And what the Marburg speech had been from Papen was basically putting up, planting a standard for the rest of the right and saying, this is our moment. Well, this is the last chance we've got. Hindenburg is still alive at that point. This is the last chance we've got to try and rein these guys in, the Nazis. And at that point, Papen is put under house arrest. It's surprising he wasn't killed. Schleicher is killed. The guy that wrote the speech is killed. All of those in that network of the old right are basically done away with. And Papen's left. And he isn't removed from his post as vice chancellor either, but he's kind of left as like the last man standing, basically terrified. And then you've got a month later, the president dies anyway. So that's the last possibility that those guys had to change something, was to appeal direct to the president, who was senile already. So once he's dead, that's it, right? That's the final, the keystone of the dictatorship. So yeah, they would have, anyone associated with those sort of old elites would have looked at the Night of the Long Knives and then the month that followed, and then finally the death of the president. They would have been waiting for the knock on the door, terrified. So their moment was the Marburg speech, which provoked this violent reaction in effect. And then after that, they're just happy to be alive.
Yeah, incredible. And Roger, we are the history book buffs. Are there any good books about this subject, Roger Moorhouse?
One of the reasons why I seem to be so remarkably well informed about the Night of the Long Knives, Antonio Senior, is that I'm actually writing about it at the moment. Because I know, who knew? Because there's no book on it, right? The last book that was written on it was written by a French journalist, which a copy of it here, called The Night of the Long Knives, Max Gallo, which came out in 1972. So, and it's not that great. It's not good. So, and there's a lot of material that's actually come out since. There's a lot of archival stuff. There's a lot of research has been done on some of the sort of post-war trials, which shed light on the circumstances of the murders and so on. So there's a lot more material to draw on. So I've got a pretty free rein. So there's nothing else in English on this. So I'm doing it. So there we are. There are a few other, like Papen, who I mentioned, wrote a memoir, which is actually really interesting. He's not a good guy. The funny thing is, like you said at the top, there are no good guys in this. I mean, there are shades of bad guy. Like some of the SS killers are the most dreadful, sadistic individuals you could imagine, who later go on to sort of lead, Einsatzgruppen killing Jews and all sorts of things. Really terrible people. But the SA are also pretty terrible people. I mean, Edmund Heines, who I mentioned, it was reckoned that he'd been like the hitman for the SA. So anyone that crossed the SA, he tended to kill them. So it was reckoned that at the time that he had committed 18 murders himself. Right, so these are the bad guys against the other bad guys, right? There's kind of no good guys at all. Even Papen, very, very flawed individual, fascinating but thoroughly flawed. He wrote a memoir which was published post-war. That's really interesting. So that's another one that people might want to look at.
Yeah.
But there's really not much on this, and I'm trying to pull it all together. So hopefully, let's fast forward a year and a half, and my book should be out, and then we can all say how wonderful it is.
Brilliant. I will look forward to that, and no doubt we will talk about the Night of the Long Knives many times then.
Let's hope so.
Listen, that was absolutely brilliant, so fascinating. And you've obviously got so much interesting stuff that you're wrestling with. I'm quite jealous that you're at that stage. It's a wonderful thing to be knee deep in a new book project. So
it is.
Thank you very much, Roger, and I'll see you next time.
See you next time.